Okay, so in this final part of this three-part lecture, we're going to start getting into the specifics, the mechanisms of speciation, so how new species are formed. In the first two parts, we talked about how do we define a species, and that was important because it really does help us understand what is the mechanism that creates new species. So, how are new species formed? There are three specific modes. The first one is allopatric. This is where populations are physically separated from each other. Parapatric, which is where populations are connected perhaps along a gradient, and we'll talk about specifics in just a moment. And sympatric speciation, where the populations that ultimately form new species are actually residing within amongst each other, so almost a mosaic. We'll talk about individual examples so you get a clearer idea. So allopatric speciation, geographic separation. So we've still got our picture here of the Galapagos. So each one of these islands has a different species of ground finch. This is one of the reasons why Darwin was so fascinated about this archipelago, because there were a lot of these different types of finches. So geographic separation, the most obvious example is on islands, but it could also be physical barriers of some form. So here we've got two different types of squirrel on either side of the Grand Canyon, which is a pretty formidable geographic barrier. They've become isolated on either side of that canyon, and over time have progressively accumulated enough changes, perhaps through adaptation to different climates on either side of those canyon, all sorts of different reasons, and they progressively diverge enough to the point that if they do come back into contact with each other, they can no longer interbreed with each other, remembering our biological species concept that we covered at the end of the last lecture. So a geographic separation imposes or enforces reproductive isolation between populations. Parapatric speciation, now we're starting to get a little bit more complicated. This is effectively a population or a species strung out along perhaps a distribution of a habitat gradient or environmental gradient. The really nice example that I use here is different types of, well, a single species of grass occurring on the fringes of an old mine site. Now, the grass has started to impinge on the mine site. It's no longer active, and we find that there are differences in the timing of flowering and subsequently pollination. So when they're off the mine site, they flower at slightly different times, a little bit earlier, and when they're on the mine site, perhaps because of the metal contamination, but for whatever reason, the flowering times are different. So the opportunity of reproducing across that porous barrier has been reduced to the point that these are now starting to form into separate species. So here we have an environmental gradient enforcing reproductive isolation between the populations on either side of this particular gradient. Another wonderful example are what we term ring species. We have here the green warbler. This is in Tibet. What we have here is a distribution of this single species that goes out, follows the suitable habitat. You'll see there's a break between the orange and the yellow parts of the distribution, and this is because of severe logging and habitat removal in certain parts of China. So the habitat for this bird is no longer existing there, but historically it was there. So it expands out its range, experiences slightly different environments to the point, and it progressively adapts or changes through general accumulation of stochastic changes through random mutation and those sorts of processes, maybe adaptation as well, but by the time they come to the ends, although they start off as a single species, they no longer recognize each other as the same species. So this is another example of how tricky it can be to define whether this is actually a single species or not. If we were to focus on the ancestral distribution, the area in green there on the Tibetan Plateau, and moved out into the blue region, we would find that they would be able to interbreed with each other. But at the tips of this ring, They're no longer capable of recognizing each other as the same species and no longer interbreed. Reproductive isolation has been imposed. So at the tips, they're different species, but at the ancestral distribution, they're the same species. So it's complicated, right? And this is why it's really interesting, because it helps us understand the mechanisms of speciation. Okay, so sympatric speciation. Historically quite controversial. It was proposed and a lot of people just didn't think it happened in nature. The reality is it does happen in nature, but it's quite rare. We have an example here of our stick insects. So basically this is a single area where individuals from different populations are potentially interacting, but they're in different areas of that particular distribution. So they're sympatric with each other. Consider a mosaic. In this instance, we have these stick insects. They're adapted to different types of vegetation. One has a stripe because of the particular type of vegetation that they're hanging out on. It makes them more cryptic and avoiding predation, while the other one is a uniform green, and again, a mechanism for avoiding predation. But they've progressively adapted and accumulated enough changes in various other aspects of their behavior, as well as morphology and their genetics, to the point that when they bump into each other on the boundaries, they no longer interbreed and they no longer recognize each other as the same species. So this is an example of sympatric speciation, no geographic separation. Okay, to emphasize, speciation occurs when reproductive isolation occurs. There are all sorts of mechanisms or ways that reproductive isolation can occur. Geographic isolation, ecological isolation, they're occurring in different habitats. Think of our mine site and the grasses. Behavioral isolation, they're perhaps using different courtship songs and they're no longer recognizing each other. That's prezygotic, that's before mating, and then they mate, and then there may be mechanical isolation. Perhaps the genitalia just don't match for these guys to actually be able to mate properly, and the eggs or sperm fail to fuse. So there's perhaps some genetic problems there as well. So before fertilization, prezygotic reproductive isolation. This is where most of our research tends to focus on, because this is where we can actually see the mechanism in place. But there's also postzygotic isolation, and this is where basically mating can occur. Sperm does fuse with the eggs, but they no longer produce viable offspring. So for example, donkeys, horses, and the mating outcome of that hybrid, which is mules. Mules are sterile. Okay, so to emphasize, speciation is about reproductive isolation, putting populations onto different trajectories, accumulation of genetic changes to the point that reproductive isolation occurs, and those populations are no longer considered to be the same species.